Hello and a warm welcome to all of you joining this video. Thank you very much for being with me. You're looking at the fabulous interior of Siena Cathedral, famous for its striped columns and inlaid marble floor. The Elizabethan poet and playwright Edward de Vere, 17th Earl of Oxford, stood here in early January 1576, admiring, no doubt, this splendid depiction of the 7 ages of man, advancing from infantia to decrepitas, a concept most famously presented in the speech All the World's a Stage, from As You Like It. Note how the grave scene is placed within a square that is centred onto a cross. Oxford would have understood the significance of that, just as he would have marvelled at the inlaid marble portrait close by of this man, Hermes Trismegistus, thrice great Hermes, an Egyptian sage, anciently identified as Hermes Mercury, who was believed in the Renaissance to have been a contemporary of Moses, living about 1400 years before Christ. It's interesting that this image should have found its way into a Catholic cathedral. There was a time when the teachings of Hermes were regarded as some form of prophecy or advance notice of the coming of Christianity. But following the popularization of his teachings in the Latin translations of Marsilio Ficino in the late 15th century, the Church spurned his writings and even executed those such as Giordano Bruno, who preached his message too loudly or too competently. The problem was that Hermes taught that man was divine, and this had a profound effect on the greatest intellectuals of the 16th and 17th centuries. People like Leonardo da Vinci, Copernicus, Kepler, Galileo, and Leibniz were all drawn to what is now known as the Hermetic philosophy. In England, this mode of understanding was embraced by such luminaries as Edward de Vere Shakespeare, Philip Sidney, Edmund Spenser, Francis Bacon, and Isaac Newton. Today, Hermeticism survives as the philosophic and theological epicenter of Freemasonry. If you want to understand the worldview of intellectual Tudor England, I recommend this scholarly English translation of the Hermetic corpus by Brian Copenhaver. There is frankly no better place to start than here. Now, Hermes argues that God is inseparable from his creation. He is all that is, and that man holds a special place as his intellect and soul are the intellect and soul of God. His earthly task, therefore, is to study God's creation and to know himself in preparation for the reunification of mind and soul after his death. Know yourself is one of the key messages of Hermes. As to is this, he writes, "The greatest evil in mankind is ignorance. Seek then a guide to take you by the hand and lead you to the portals of knowledge. There shines the light, cleansed of all darkness." He's talking, of course, of the ignorance of self, the ignorance of God. Seek then a guide to take you by the hand. Well, who better to do that than William Shakespeare, who stands immortally in Leicester Square, cast in marble, pointing to his own words, "There is no darkness but ignorance," clearly drawn directly from Hermes Trismegistus. The idea, Shakespeare's idea, and all of these Hermetic thinkers' idea, is that man is born under a veil. Hermes calls it a tunic, and you might think of it as some sort of garment. It's the invisibility of the divine, the spirit that is within you as we plod around here on earth. As Ficino writes, "Know thyself, divine race, clothed with a mortal garment." And Shakespeare writes in Twelfth Night, "A spirit I am indeed, but am in that dimension grossly clad, which from the womb I did participate." Exactly the same thought. Shakespeare very, very close to the Hermetic philosophers and to Hermes Trismegistus. At the centre, I believe, of the English Hermetic movement was this man, John Dee. We've talked about him on previous presentations. He was the Queen's conjurer, astrologer, astronomer, mathematician, a man of great interest and great mystery, and the more one looks into him, the more one realizes that. I have on previous presentations shown you this, the title page of his all-important book, the Monas Hieroglyphica. It is a book not, as it appears to be, about a symbol, but in his mind, at least, it is a book about the literal signature of the beginning and root of all things, of the universal force of creation, from whence all knowledge derives. And being a Hermetic book, it is of course about man's relationship to God and man's divinity. He calls this image the Hermetic Seal of London. You're looking now at a slightly later 16th century edition. You can see it has the 4 elements in the corners: fire, air, earth and water, with the sun and moon encased into a square, which is the measurable symbol of the material world. Inside there also we see the egg, the cosmic egg, from whence God created everything, and inside that the monas itself, the monad, which on the face of it just appears to be the symbol of Mercury, Hermes. There we go again, this idea of Hermes and his teaching of divine man. There's a little bit more to it than just the symbol of Mercury, because you can see it has a dot, and also at the bottom what appears to be a sort of sign of Aries. John Dee calls it Mercury fortified by a sharp point. It is by virtue of this point, he says, and the monad itself, that all things begin to emerge in principle. The monas itself is deceptively simple. It consists of 1 dot and 6 lines, 7 things in all. 7 is the number that connects man to God, as we shall see a little bit later on. Dee says in his dedication to the Emperor Maximilian, "Here is secretly whispered and intimated that by the square mystery of this hieroglyphic monad, something circular and wholly equal is being conveyed." Notice how coy he's being, talking about something that is secretly whispered and conveyed. Well, it's pretty obvious what he's talking about, because he's talking about something that is at once square and circular. He's talking about the squaring of the circle. If you were to take a compass and stick the metal point into the central point that he's talking about at the bottom there, and connect the pencil to either of the 2 top bits of those horns, you could then draw a circle that represents divinity, God. A circle, of course, has no beginning and no end. If you were to make the compass a little bit smaller and put the point again in that center point, but this time put the pencil at the midway point in that semicircle that I've ringed there, you could draw another circle, which Dee coyly intimates in his 3rd theorem is the earth. Now we can put a square around that earth, whose 4 sides, each of its 4 sides, are equal to the diameter. And already something extremely interesting has happened, for not only is that purple square sharing its center with that green circle, but it also has a perimeter that is exactly equal to the circumference of the green circle. So this squaring of the circle, something that's been mathematicians have been doing endlessly since Archimedes, has a great symbolic value, because it indicates that the material world, God's creation, is unified with God. If you were to take the most famous image of all time regarding the square of the circle, Leonardo da Vinci's Thessalian Man, notice how his fingertips, whether they're on his straight arms or his upraised arms, and ditto his feet, are either touching the divine green circle or the square of the material world. What Leonardo da Vinci is telling us here is that man is divine. He is, of course, fully in with the Hermetic philosophy, but he's a little bit nervous of it. He knows that if he's caught, he'll be done in by the Inquisition, which is why he doesn't place his square, notice, right in the center of the circle. His square does not share the same center as the green circle, very deliberately to get himself, I think, out of trouble, but the point is very clearly made. Going back to Dee's monas, Dee says that the semicircle represents the moon, and he says that the full circle beneath that, with the dot in it, represents the sun. Why are they, you might ask, of the same size? Well, Dee says that the ordinary man, as from Earth, would see, and he's quite right about this, the full moon at night as being exactly the same size as the sun, so very much taken from the perspective of the earth. Another very extraordinary aspect of this is that the moon and the earth in this diagram set up by Dee's Monas Hieroglyphica are in precisely the correct proportion one to the other. And this is something I am going to come back to, and I'm going to link it to the number 1740 and to William Shakespeare. I have, I believe, some very interesting material to share with you about this, so please bear with me, particularly since I'm going to have to go over some, I think, very critical, very important material that I've shown before on previous presentations. It will be worth it, I believe, if you stick with me, even if some of these things you think you have seen before. So we're going back, first of all, to John Dee, his belief that man is part of God, that man is divine, therefore his belief that the Trinity is not just the Godhead as is seen in the Christian church, but is a 3+1, a fourth part. The quaternary, as he writes, is concealed within the ternary. O God, forgive me if I have sinned against thee by revealing such a great mystery in my writings, which all may read. He goes on to say, but only, of course, the worthy will understand. I've shown, I think, several times how this symbol of the Tau, the sacred symbol of the Tau, can be convened into what is known as the Triple Tau, very sacred to Royal Arch Freemasons, and we can trace Royal Arch symbolism straight back to Dee, and that this has within it this Triple Tau, the quaternary that is concealed within it, that fourth T there upside down. Now, John Dee believes that all number, all letter is God, that God is the Alpha and the Omega, and he's all letters between. And Hermes Trismegistus writes that God is all number. And one of the intellectual exercises that Dee sets up to get man closer to God is that he should be led upward, conceiving numbers absolutely, that at length he may be able to find the number of his own name gloriously exemplified and registered in the Book of Trinity, most blessed and eternal. This is a curious exercise to ask others to do, but he sets an example by doing the same himself. How does he do it? How do you conceive of numbers absolutely so that you can get your own name linked within the Trinity? Well, one little trick, he gives us a clue about how to do it. He says there are specific reasons for the shapes of letters, their positions or places within the order of the alphabet, their numerical value, and many other things that must be considered with regards to the primary alphabets of the three languages. By the three languages, he means Latin, Ancient Greek, and Hebrew. He's not at all interested in finding out the number of a letter in the English alphabet, where, for instance, you have W and J, which were sort of modern additions. He will stick to the Latin, Greek, or Hebrew alphabet. So he's going to use those to try and get the number of his own name and align it to the Trinity. He does that with this symbol quite simply. It's a triangle. Well, yes, that represents the Trinity, followed by a dot, which in Hebrew is known as the hirik. He calls it shirik, and it tells you to pronounce E after the consonant before it. That consonant is the delta of Greek, pronounced D. So that gives his name D, and you notice that the delta is the fourth letter of the Greek alphabet. So he has the quaternary concealed within the ternary, and he's found his own name, D. Thus he signs off the Monas Hieroglyphica, Dicit litera quata, Seth, the fourth letter. Now let us turn to our great friend Edward de Vere, 17th Earl of Oxford, intellectual poet, steeped in the Hermetic traditions and believed in the Trinity as something other than the Church. He said of it, he affirmed that the wise philosophers deride our ignorance in that great mystery. According to one of his contemporaries, he realizes that there is the quaternity concealed within the ternary. If you read his early poem, My Mind to Me a Kingdom Is, and you read the first chapter of the Hermetic Corpus by Hermes Trismegistus, you'll realize they are talking of the same thing, which is the theory of the sovereignty of mind. One of Edward de Vere's favourite poems, according to Thomas Nash, was Nosce te ipsum, Know Thyself, by John Davis. This is an outright declaration of Hermetic thought, saying that the human soul and the human mind are God. It's actually dedicated to Queen Elizabeth. Rather implies that Elizabeth was in on all this great secret. So Oxford, what did he do in order to find the number of his own name gloriously exemplified and registered in the Trinity? Well, he declared himself 1740. We've seen how T is 19 and how the triple tau is therefore 3/19, which is 57. 17 plus 40 equals 57. So there he goes, aligning himself to the Trinity. But remember that he thinks there is a quaternary hidden within that, and so he uses a clever Tudor pun, 17-4T, the 4T being the material world that is connected to the Trinity. But also, as my friend, the scholar John Anthony, has pointed out, 4T is 4/19, and 4/19 are 76, and you only have to look at the numerical gematria below to spell OXFORED and look at the numbers of that, and you will see that Oxford is 76, and therefore by saying 1740 you are alluding to the 17th Earl of Oxford. So he's done exactly what John Dee wanted him to do, which is to find the number of his own name gloriously exemplified and registered in the Trinity, and particularly that rather confusing Trinity with its extra part. No doubt then he sees the importance of putting that into his own signature and having 10 plus 7, which obviously equals 17, and 4 multiplied by 10, which equals 40, very cleverly encrypted in that beautiful signature that also shows that he is an earl with the coronet and the raised pearls above it. Clearly, if this man is going to use a pseudonym, he is not going to let go of his identification with God and of the fact that the works that he writes are written by him and God combined. So he takes the double V, V being 20 in the Latin alphabet, 2 20s therefore are 40, and he follows it by 17 letters, which very cleverly allude to the will that shook the spear at Ilium. That's the will of Pallas, who became the Roman goddess of playwrights. So therefore you get your 1740 mirrored as 4017 in the pseudonym. There were others, not just Edward de Vere, who seemed to be aware of this identification and what he was up to. There's a wonderful work called Polymantia by William Covell, published in 1595. And on this page, you see the 17th full word from the end of the page is Oxford. That gives you 17, followed by a T, which in fact the 4T, because it's directly underneath the word fortunately, which is the 17th word of that sentence. It is also, by the way, that T, the 4th T on that line. So it's 1740. And if you count the words backwards from the end of the page, including the words that are in the margin notes, not just the main text, then the 17th word is Shakespeare. That is followed by 4x. X is 10 in Latin, so 4x's is therefore 40, and once again he is aligned to the 4th T, counting backwards in that line. In case anyone didn't understand how brilliant that was and how he's shown you that both Oxford and Shakespeare are 1740 and therefore they're one and the same, you only have to look at the line which is annotated by the margin note, Sweet Shakespeare, to see it says Court Dear verse, all hyphenated up with a little jiggle. That becomes Our de Vere a Secret. A bit of a slam dunk, that one, for those who are interested in the authorship question of William Shakespeare. Now, if I skip you forward to the year in which this magnificent monument was erected to William Shakespeare in Westminster Abbey, then obviously I'm taking you to 1740. And you can see by the scroll he is pointing at, the line of the cloud-cut towers. They've removed the E from towers to make it 17 letters in that line, crossed with the 4T across it going down. If we go back to what the monument looked like when it was first erected, it had 17 iron spears in front of it, and, well, still does have him standing in such a way as to indicate 4x, which is 4T. And if I were to turn the monument round, or better still, if I could see it from behind, which I can't, but if I were to turn it round, it has the same effect, then we can reinterpret the shape of his stance as the Christogram Chi Rho, the Rho being the 17th letter of the Greek alphabet and the Chi being 40 in biblical gematria. That's the gematria that John Dee would have understood more than the more common isopsophy. So beautifully done that. You see the 3 plus 1, the 3 1740s in the number and the 1 1740 as a pun. The first edition of Shakespeare's sonnets, 1609, also conceal the Chi-Rho, concealing it, of course, because it indicates the Hermetic idea of divine man. It was the Oxfordian Alan Green who first showed that these line ends and dots could be joined up to reveal 4 right-angled triangles and a perfect circle hidden there. What he didn't know when he found that is by coming down through the stem of that P, you can in fact create the Chi-Rho symbol and therefore the 1740. Nor did he realize that that amazing chi is pointing to the author of the sonnets, being by God and De Vere. God represented by the capital G, the 7th letter of the alphabet. And then, of course, that line down at the bottom, which is 17 letters with 4T right in the middle of it, pointing to where Edward de Vere is actually buried, which is underneath the monument we've just been looking at in Westminster Abbey. But that's another story for another time. So we've seen how Edward de Vere aligns his 1740 with the Christogram, the Chi-Rho symbol, and here he does a very similar thing, aligning 1740 with God as the Alpha and Omega, the beginning and the end. This is the dedication to Venus and Adonis, the first time the name William Shakespeare ever occurs in connection with literature. And this is the dedication to Henry Roseley, Earl of Southampton, all written in italics, except for right at the beginning, the R, which is the 17th letter of the Roman alphabet, and at the end, your honours in all duty, comma, William Shakespeare, dot, which is 40 characters. So 1740 at the beginning and end. Very similar thing seems to happen here. These are the last 2 sonnets of 1609 edition, and you'll notice that they're more or less the same. I won't read them all to you, but number 153 begins, Cupid laid his brand and fell asleep. 154 begins, the little love god lying once asleep, laid by his side his heart inflaming brand. It goes on like that all the way through. They've basically got the same contents. Now, I had some correspondence with a very clever Oxfordian who said to me, did I realise that there was something in this 153, 154, that these 2 numbers in modern mathematics are what's called a Routh-Arron pair, because they have the sum of their distinct primes are the same. 153, the distinct primes are 17 and 3, which add up to 20, and 154, the distinct primes of that number are 2, 7 and 11, which equally add up to 20. I thought this was particularly interesting because we know that 153 and 154 form a group, and that the sum of their primes adding to the same thing, both 20, means that the 2 together have this inner soul, if you like, represented as 40. And why that's particularly interesting is because they end the whole of the sonnet sequence, and as we all know, the other most famous group of sonnets is the one that begins the whole sequence, known as the procreation sonnets, of which there are 17. So once again, you get this alpha, omega, the beginning and the end, 17 and 40, just as you had on the dedication to Venus and Adonis. What particularly interested me about this is the idea of adding up the divisors of a number, and I looked into that a little bit and discovered that it was very much an important thing for those who believed, going right back to Pythagoras, Euclid and before, who believed in the divinity of number, and therefore were always curious about the sum of a number's divisors, which they almost regarded as the soul of that number. A perfect number, for instance, is one like 6, where the divisors 1, 2, 3 and 6 add up to twice the number itself, add up to 12. Another example of a perfect number is 28, whose divisors 1, 2, 4, 7, 14 and 28 add up to 56, which is twice 28. Why I bring this up is the mere fact that it is called a perfect number, or in Greek, teleos arithmos, and the mere fact that it's being called perfect shows the huge importance that was placed by the ancient philosophers and mathematicians on the sum of a number's divisors, on the soul, if you like, of that number. And that did get me to ask a question. Given the historic importance of the sum of the divisor of a number to the number itself, what then of that all-important number to Edward de Vere 1740? What are the sum of its divisors, and are they important? Are they relevant? Well, there are 24 of them, and they add up to 5,040. Now, that number would have meant absolutely nothing to me a week or so ago, but I just happened to have been reading a book I was given for Christmas called The Dimensions of Paradise by John Michel, written in 1971. A very excellent book indeed. Sacred Geometry, Ancient Science, and the Heavenly Order of Earth. And I just happened to remember that 5040 came up several times in that book, so I went back to it to investigate. It was one of Plato's favourite numbers, and Plato was very well known to Edward de Vere, who as a teenager bought his first copy of a folio edition. He probably also owned the 1578 edition, this one, that was ultimately inscribed to Ben Jonson by his son Henry, 18th Earl of Oxford. So he knew his Plato very well. He would have known that Plato talks about the number 5040 in his Laws, talks about the ideal number for a city, the ideal number of citizens in it. He mentions the number 7 times, and that is because it has a very peculiar connection to the number 7. 1 times 2 times 3 times 4 times 5 times 6 times 7 is 5040. 5040 also equals 7 times 8 times 9 times 10. It is also the sum of the internal angles of the first 7 shapes. I'm sure Edward de Vere would have known all this, and given Edward de Vere's huge interest in the stars, in the planets, as one contemporary says, for who marketh better than he the 7 turning flames of the sky, he certainly would have known the book by John Dee called Preparatory Aphorisms, which discusses the number 5040, and in particular its relation to the number 7. Dee writes, man's body and all other elemental bodies are altered, disposed, ordered, pleasured and displeasured by the influential working of the sun, moon and other stars and planets. And since the power of the planets is unequal, nature is able to control their working in 5040 different ways. Notice also that on this page Dee talks of Hermes Trismegistus. He's saying, as Hermes Trismegistus teaches, nothing happens to men without cosmic sympathy. I want to therefore look a little bit deeper at this number 5040, and particularly its connection to 7 and to 1740 and the stars. Dee's great friend, the spiritual friend Edward Kelly, wrote, God has stamped and sealed all created things with the character of Trinity as a kind of hieroglyphical writing, whereby his own nature might be known, for the number 3 and the magic number 4 make up the perfect number 7, the seal of many mysteries, and seeing that the quaternary rests within the ternary, there we go again, it is a number which stands on the horizon of eternity and doth exhibit everything bound with God in us, thus including God, men, and all created things with all their mysterious powers. So 7, therefore, is the number that represents the divinity of man and man's connection with all created things in the Trinity, which is exactly what we're talking about in terms of this Hermetic philosophy. So let us go back then to where we sort of started, to the geometry of the moon and the earth, which is so fascinating and so relevant to 5040. If I were to find the very center point of the moon and the center point of the earth, put them together and join a straight line, we would find that that line is 5040 miles long. I am, of course, aware that the Earth bulges around the equator, that it has mountains and valleys, ditto the moon, so that I'm talking about the mean diameter of the Earth and of the moon. If I were to draw a circle with a radius of 5040 miles, it would have a circumference of 31,680 miles. If I were to square that circle by putting a square around it, which has each of its sides the same as the diameter of the Earth, that's 7,920 miles, then that square, as we saw at the beginning, would be 31,680 miles, i.e. it'd be precisely the same as the circumference of the green circle. Now this is very extraordinary, you might think, because we're dealing with something that is God-made, the moon and the earth, and we seem to be finding some repetition that we saw in the Vessalian Man of Leonardo da Vinci and in the hieroglyphic monad of John Dee. This goes on, this very extraordinary situation. If I were to put a square round the moon such that each of its sides is equal to the diameter of the moon, and then draw diagonals across it like that, I would find I have two perfect Pythagorean 3, 4, 5 right-angled triangles. You might think, well, that's quite ordinary, quite normal, but it isn't. You've got to think, if the moon were 60 miles fatter or the earth were 100 miles shorter or whatever, this simply wouldn't be possible. And the triangles, the perfect right-angled triangles, are worshipped, going right back to Pythagoras and to the ancient Egyptians. There's something extremely special about a triangle with those proportions of those sides. If I give you the actual miles of each of those lines, you see straight away something again rather peculiar, that the two sides opposite the hypotenuse are equal to 5,040, this number that we seem to keep coming back to. Here I'm introducing to you the Platonic solids, the four-sided tetrahedron, the six-sided cube, the eight-sided octahedron, and the 20-sided isosahedron. I bring these ones up because they are known as the Platonic solids, that were the symbols of the four elements: fire, earth, air and water. Underneath them I've put the sum of their internal angles, and straight away you might realize something funny is going on. If we look at water, the isosahedron has internal angles of 3,600 degrees, the same number as we have in miles up on the hypotenuse of this triangle up there. If we look at Earth, the internal angles are 2,160 degrees, which in miles is the same as the diameter of the moon. Octahedron, air, has internal angles of 1,440 degrees, which is exactly half of that third side. If I were to add up all of the internal angles of all of these Platonic solids, I would find they come to 7,920 degrees, which is the same in miles as the diameter of the Earth. If I were just to add octahedron and isosahedron, the air and water, their combined internal angles come to 5,040. The fire, the tetrahedron, is particularly interesting. You can see it's in the shape of a pyramid, and they say sometimes that the word pyre or pyromaniac is connected to pyramid through fire. Its internal angles are 720 degrees, and that number connects to all of the numbers in miles that we have in our diagram of the moon and the earth. So if we look at that 3, 4, 5 triangle at the top, 3 times 720 is 2,160, 4 times is 2,880, 5 times is 3,600, 7 times, here we go with 7 again, is 5,040, and 11 times 720 is 7,920. So something very strange seems to be going on, and I hope you begin to understand why the ancients, who believed that God created the universe using number and geometry, were not simply believing in what they wanted to believe in a fable. They were very, very clever people indeed, who saw the connection, mathematical connection, between the natural world and numbers and geometry, and therefore believed that is how God created it. And not only that, that brings us to the Hermetic belief. Why do we see this? Why are we able to understand that this isosahedron, which is water, connects to these different figures? Well, it's because we have the mind of God. This doesn't end here, this most extraordinary thing, because if you were to divide 5,040 into twice the diameter, we get pi, 22 over 7. And pi, of course, that most mysterious and perplexing of all numbers that relates to the ratio of the diameter of a circle to its circumference. If we were to triangulate this in such a way that the base, the diameter of the Earth, is joined to the apex at the center of the moon, and then we can divide this hypotenuse, 6,409.61 miles, by this radius, which is 3,960 miles, we get 1.618, which is phi, that golden ratio exemplified by the Fibonacci sequence that we find in so much of God's creation, from flowers to snail shells to DNA, and of course we use it in computers and God knows what. It is a great force of creation, phi, and there it is, just sitting there, just as these angles 51.84 are sitting there, and all of this triangle is replicated precisely in the cross section of the last remaining great wonder of the world, the Great Pyramid at Giza. The Egyptians, when they built it, measured the pyramid at Giza in Royal Egyptian cubits, of course, not in miles. So the base is 440 Royal Egyptian cubits. The original height was 280. And the perimeter is obviously 4 times 440, which is 1,760 Royal Egyptian cubits. You might recognize that number, 1,760, because that is the number of yards in the statute mile. Now you've got to remember that miles were formalized, let's say, probably by John Dee in 1592 in London. So there's some weird connection going on here. Just as the fact that we're talking about Royal Egyptian cubits, but the English cubit was divided into 18 inches. And it's a very curious fact that if you times these Royal Egyptian cubit measurements by 18, we get right back to where we started. So 440 times 18 is 7,920, which in miles is the diameter of the Earth. 280 times 18 is 5,040, which is the combined radius of the Moon and the Earth. And 1760 times 18 is 31,680, which, as we saw, was the circumference of that green circle and also the perimeter of that purple square. So a lot of extremely rum things going on that connect us with our 5040 and bring us back to Dee and his extraordinary Monus Hieroglyphica that carries the same great secret as the Great Pyramid at Giza, and that secret is ultimately telling us, as I said, that man is divine, hence that ancient wisdom. Now, just before I leave this subject, a very interesting point about English miles. You might be saying to yourself, why do I keep banging on about English miles when I'm talking about Egyptian monuments where that mile didn't exist? The relation between ancient measurements and the mile was devised, as I say, probably by Dee very specifically and very carefully. If we look at the ratio of the Greek mile to the Roman mile, it's the same as the ratio of the English mile to the Greek mile, which is 25/24. And here's an interesting thing. 1 Greek mile equals 5,040 English feet. If I take large round numbers of Greek feet, cubits, miles, Roman feet, cubits, miles, and put them all into English feet, you will notice that there seems to be a common factor that relates one to the other, and that is the number 5,040. So that 5,040 becomes an extremely important number, not only in the alignment of the planets, the conjunction of the planets, as Dee tells us, but also in the measurement of the Earth. And therefore the connection between 5,040 and 1740 being the sum of its divisors must have been of extreme relevance and importance to Edward de Vere, because not only was he aligning himself to the Trinity in 1740, but through the soul of that number, 5,040, he was very much aligning himself to God as geometer, as the grand architect of the universe, and to that great G, the seventh letter, placed at the center of that iconic mark, the square and compass emblem of Freemasonry. I really hope that this has not been too complicated, too esoteric. I do try my hardest to make these presentations as clear and as simple and as memorable as possible, because I think they contain enough significant material to show that Edward de Vere was the man behind the pseudonym William Shakespeare, but also to show that in his mind, at least, in Dee's mind, in Bacon's mind, that the works of Shakespeare were written by God and Edward de Vere. Thank you very much indeed for listening to this. and please subscribe, please press the bell button, and you'll be notified when the next presentation is ready.